one speaker, John Cartwright, was being load shedded during this particular point in time. So he's had to come to my house and he's going to be speaking from here. Siphelele Ngobese with the South African Cities Network, she's available. She's going to be engaging as well. Lauren October from the Safety and Violence Initiative was facilitating this particular meeting, but unfortunately she's been load shedded as well, and she's based in Gouda in the rural areas, and there's no electricity and she doesn't have transport at the moment, so she couldn't travel anywhere else. So what I'm going to suggest we do is Siphelele, if you're good to go, and then I will bring John into my office, and then at least he can participate from here. So Siphelele, over to you if you can hear me and you're ready to start your presentation.
I'm ready to go. So I'll just share my screen in a sec.
So while Siphelele does this is the second webinar of a weekly webinar series we're hosting through SaferSpaces. The first one we had, which was looking at the role of smartphone technology and crime and violence prevention. So we had 3 speakers last week. And today is looking at focusing on designing in for community safety. So we have 2 really interesting speakers. Siphelele Ngobese is with the South African Cities Network, where she's been facilitating the really important work of the Urban Safety Reference Group. So without any further ado, Siphelele, I'm going to hand over to you. Are you able to share your screen?
Yes, but maybe first I can just introduce myself so people aren't listening to a ghost. So I'll just start my camera for a second. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me at these sessions. I very much enjoyed the first one that was held last week. So it's really an honor to be asked to come and share some of our learnings at SACN and as the Urban Safety Reference Group with yourselves today. So I'm just going to cut off my camera now that I've introduced my. By the way, I'm Siphelele, who is the coordinator for the Urban Safety Reference Group at the SACN, just by the way. So I'm going to stop my camera and share my screen. So just to start, I'm not going to be presenting per se. I'm just going to be sharing with you some of the things that our member cities have been doing in response to this theme. So I struggled a bit because designing in safer spaces. So is it designing in safer spaces or designing in safer spaces? And I think it's open to interpretation, particularly for the South African cities context, that is where we work within a field where shifting from inequality, exclusion to inclusion and equality is one of the preoccupations, or should be rather the preoccupations of the planning space. And so how do you design in to radically challenge and undo spatial inequality, the spatial mismatch between jobs, opportunities, and which then has an impact on well-being in cities, and on life chances and ability to kind of improve your lot in life, and which is what cities really represent. I mean, objectively, cities are where average incomes are higher than any other locality in the country. And so they have a developmental role beyond just the mechanical delivery of basic services, which are also kind of important to well-being. But there's a bigger goal of moving more of our urban residents into sustainable livelihood. And really that is the why of doing. And so what are the design aspects? And for us as SACN, the question has, or rather what we've determined to be a key area of intervention when shifting from inequality to equality, when shifting from inequity to equity, and likewise exclusion to inclusion. We deem that space is a critical area of intervention in facilitating that shift, together with economy, society and institutions. So that's just the context that we are coming from as SACN, and the grounding for the work that we do in the area of urban safety, which falls within our Inclusive Cities programmatic response to all the issues that I've kind of outlined. So with regards to the work that we do as the Urban Safety Reference Group around the designing in of safer spaces, I won't bore you too much with some of the objective data, but this is the context within which cities are operating, where violence and crime rates are objectively higher in the 9 metros that we survey than anywhere else. So this is just a view on just the score of murder, of average murder rates in cities compared to the national average. Sorry about that. Compared to the national average that you'll see on a dotted line, you'll then see that quite a few of the 9 cities of the 9 major metros in South Africa far outstrip the average murder rates of the nation. And so we've, as the Urban Safety Reference Group, in response to this, is that we've said that there needs to be some spatial interventions, but more than that, safety seen as a transversal area of work, and where there are inputs by different actors within a city and among society as well. And in terms of the recommendations that we've put forward in our incremental evidence collection around this issue, looking specifically at the city level, is to perhaps start to address the structural drivers of violence and crime. Hence, we've created an indicator tool that is a composite of various indicators. So looking at integrating the objectives indicators, meaning the crime stats, with social and structural risk factors, and then looking at the strategy types that you have across government, starting at the local level, and really driving at the point around supporting evidence-based responses by cities. And so it relates to this point we've been driving about the why of what we do, and why we do, being people at the center, being about livelihoods, and being about equity and inclusion, and doing various forms of exclusion, including spatial. Another recommendation really has been around co-creating public space with communities. So really taking integrated approaches further than just an all of government approach, where there is a role for different actors, be it the planning function in a city, the community development, the economic development function, knowing and understanding their role in safety promotion, but going out to all of society and co-creating spaces with communities and other stakeholders. And it's really a point around how do you design in safer spaces. Communities are a critical component of doing that. So in terms of bringing them in. So I'll get into some of what our member cities are involved with that centers around designing in co-creative practice, and therefore safer spaces that are owned by communities and various stakeholders involved are. So this point is a critical point of designing in safer spaces, and as far as some cities are testing approaches to deepening participation in the planning, design, and even management of public spaces post-delivery. And then another point which relates to what I said earlier around evidence collection, evidence-based practice, is the development of city-wide safety strategies as a way to sustainably reduce crime and violence. And so that is another aspect of how you design in safer spaces into the system. Responses can't be ad hoc and relating to incidents and trends as and when they happen, but cities need to have a clear view and an objective and reliable view of where crime is concentrated in the city, of where to channel and target their responses, particularly in the context of diminished budgets, given our current economic climate. And so how do you make the best use of available resources, and through citywide safety strategies, you can more ably do that, and you can structure your interventions so that they are targeted and they target the reduction of crime and violence on a sustainable basis. So in terms of just I'll give just one example of what our member cities in the Urban Safety Reference Group are involved with, that starts to speak to the elements that I've just introduced of designing in safer spaces. So the City of Johannesburg, in partnership with others, has had a series of interventions that look at activating public space, and that's on various aspects. Activating public space in terms of inviting communities in to be in those spaces and to own those spaces, but also in terms of their participatory processes, where they've developed various tools of community engagement. So some interesting innovations, including the use of Minecraft to harvest and include the views of children and younger people in urban public spaces. And the recognitions that drive the approach are kind of articulated in the slide. So responding to illegal activities, unregulated activities, the sale of illicit substances, vandalism, dumping, open fires, and even some really grievous violent crimes, including murders, theft, assault, rape, and so on. And so how do you respond to these challenges in a way that is inclusive of communities from the planning stage to the implementation and even the management of a space post delivery? So what the City of Joburg has done, among other interventions, as I've mentioned, the social activation of public parks and spaces to create opportunities for community ownership. This was tested in N Street North Park, in addition to another park space in the city. And as you'll see at the bottom of the slide, these are some of the partnerships that were critical to that process. And it really speaks to the key priority around partnering and working together so that you can sustain the interventions and inputs. And I think partnership is also another key, very relevant aspect of designing in safer spaces. So in terms of the participatory aspect of the intervention, as I mentioned, it was very in-depth with various components that speak to and rope in a cross-section of members of communities, including children. And then in terms of just the park activations, it became a method for the city of building trust as well as creating safer spaces. And so really driving that point around community ownership. In terms of the knowledge production that we do as the Urban Safety Reference Group in support of these kinds of practices, and with the support of cities and kind of identifying the key areas of input from a research perspective so that you can support evidence-based interventions. In addition to our annual State of Urban Safety reports, we do also produce smaller products such as policy briefs, and mostly recently responding to the question around participation and the usual nature of participation to be rather exclusionary, and just speaking to the relationship between communities and the local state not being at the right level of depth, so that urban citizens can really say that they are participants in decision making, not just in terms of very structured, invited spaces of participation that may not go deep enough, and where sometimes the intended outcome has already been decided before the community engagement even happens. So we've explored this issue, and we've explored the barriers to in-depth community participation and community engagement by local authorities, particularly safety units within cities. We initiated a process of developing in the pool of our different products, such as practice guides. We thought it might be important to start to engage around the issue of community engagement, and maybe even create a practical guide on how these things can be approached, so that you can further safety consciousness within communities, bring communities in as significant stakeholders in the process, and thereby designing in a community-led, a community-centric and conscious way of building safer spaces and safer cities. We've also done some work around public space, and it draws from the experiences and the practices of our participating and member cities, really, like the case that I've just introduced, that is being tested in various spaces within the city of Johannesburg. So we've engaged with issues of public space and urban safety, focusing on different aspects, really, and most striking for me is starting to consider what safer spaces are for vulnerable groups within a city. So for children, for women, for people with disabilities, and people really who may be victim to multiple deprivations and exclusions in a city. So how do you design spaces that are safe for women? It's not interventions, but it's also about social attitudes and changing social attitudes to women, so that women can be safe in public spaces. So those are just some of the things that we are involved in that speak to this theme of designing in safer spaces. And yeah, we hope that it's a contribution to the conversation, really, and we're open to engaging more with everybody in the space and in this room around that, and how we can improve our ideas, and looking really for opportunities to test and apply some of the products that we've been developing in partnership with various stakeholders. And yeah, I'll stop there for an input, but I'm really looking forward to a conversation around this. And thanks again for having us.
It's a pleasure, Siphelele. Thank you so much for the time to be involved in them. Just kind of having to make a plan here, because John's actually had to pop into my house and into my study. So he's going to be doing a presentation shortly, but I just wanted to check if there are any comments, any quick questions or questions of clarification, specifically relating to Siphelele's presentation. Please do use the raise the hand function. Melanie, your hand is up. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Siphelele. That's fantastic. You guys are really doing great work. I just had a question, working, the process sounds quite intensive, both in terms of resources and the technical capacity you are providing. And, working with municipalities which are really stretched at the moment, both in terms of capacity and resources. Is the model adaptable to those contexts, or have you had some ideas about how it could be rolled out? I know you're working primarily with cities, but even in intermediary cities or in district municipalities, where they have severe constraints and maybe not that level of technical capacity support that you guys are providing. So just your thoughts, I'd be interested in. Thanks.
Thanks, Melanie. Siphelele, do you want to respond now?
I don't know if you want to take just a couple more maybe, or I'm happy to go.
Sure, let me just see any other quick questions or comments. At the moment, there's going to be a bit more time at the end as well, if anyone's got any burning questions right now.
Okay, so I'll take Melanie's in the meantime.
Margaret has her hand up. So Margaret, if you'd like to ask your question. You are muted, Margaret. Margaret,
hi, I'm just trying to fix my microphone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Really good insights there. I just wanted to find out what is your view. I actually have two questions about the CID model, the City Improvement District model, as a way of encouraging not just or encouraging a bottom-up kind of partnership with the community when it comes to issues of designing in safety, and also what have you come across any issues about how communities are organizing on themselves without involvement of the local government through residents associations, for example, and just purely having a very isolated kind of organization where they only partner with other neighborhoods or neighboring suburbs, and just your inputs on if you've come across something like that. Sorry, I missed the first part of your presentation because I was trying to connect, but yeah.
Great. Siphelele, do you want to take those questions?
Yeah.
John, a chance to present after you.
Okay, so just in response to Melanie's question, I think it's something that we've also grappled with, even before the current context of COVID. One of cities that are stretched for resources, both human and financial, hence our advocacy point, or one of our advocacy points, has been on the clarification of roles and responsibilities, and also fiscal allocations to the area of safety promotion, because as you might know, the mandate of community safety was handed down to cities and was not complemented with a fiscal injection into supporting those functions. And so already as it is, cities are having to tap into their own already kind of limited budgets in order to respond to this well, unfunded, and now the more accepted terminology is that underfunded mandates, of which community safety is one. But I think it's exacerbated by COVID, and cities have had, I think if it wasn't pronounced before, I wouldn't know what to call it now, but there's a lot of pressing needs upon cities to respond to from a social, financial perspective, that sometimes the investments into knowledge and knowledge platforms like the SACN may become secondary. At the same time, though, I think even with a lot of devastation, economic devastation, there's a greater appreciation for evidence and data, and so it's a hybrid experience of both extremely stretched budgets, but also an appreciation for evidence. I would just speak to, in terms of just some of the interventions and things and ideas that we are seeing, and that we are hoping to tap into as the Urban Safety Reference Group. Some of the COVID responses that are happening in partnerships, for example, between our National Department of Public Works, working in partnership with partners such as GIZ on COVID response mechanisms. So there's one example to be piloted in KZN, I think in eThekwini, Msunduzi, and one other smaller municipality, implemented through the Stepping Stones Project Empower project, and really a response during COVID to something that's really been a problem and even more pronounced now in COVID, which is gender-based violence. So those are some of the initiatives, and those are some of the techniques of maneuvering in a situation where there are really limited resources. So really, again, partnering between public institutions, development agencies, and really there's room for other partners. There's untapped potential, particularly within the partnering with the private sector space and indeed communities. So that's just one example of what we're seeing of work having to continue even in a very hard to navigate terrain such as this one. I hope that answers your question, Melanie. And to Margaret, in terms of what my view is of the CID model and what examples and issues. Okay, so the question around communities organizing in their own corners without much government intervention. My response to that, in terms of like the research that we are doing at SACN, I would put forward the argument is that it's not always the case where government intervention kind of works out for the good. And so where we are seeing it, it needs to have like a positive impact, and it's not necessarily a bad thing where communities are organizing on their own and identifying problems and responding from a local knowledge perspective to their own problems. Where they would need some intervention from the state, perhaps, is through more capacitation. But I think in some instances, we have to be careful around state intervention. Sometimes the things that manifest organically are exactly the right types of things that need to happen. However, I would say that from my observation, although there's a lot of local action happening, it hasn't reached the right level of integration in terms of inter-community connectivities that are needed to kind of scale these types of interventions. So a lot what communities are doing within their own resources and what they're able to do in their own little corners. It does need a groundswell of like them connecting with each other. Maybe that would assist in scaling some of the interventions. And I think those are the people that know. And so, yeah, going back to the point around state intervention, I think it would have to be the how of state intervention would have to be very clear about the parameters so you don't ruin a good thing. On the point around the CID model, I would lean more towards perhaps, and I think our colleagues at the National Treasury would be happy around this, of neighborhood development. Again, a model that draws on communities and different actors within a space, and that also see a space as an economic good as well. So I think those kinds of interventions are good in that The point is also to have thriving local economies that also contribute to sustainable livelihoods. So neighborhood development mechanisms that are driven from the national level, supported through the local, and bringing in communities and various actors, academic institutions, a business sector, and communities themselves.
Thanks so much, Siphelele. Really interesting responses and some really good questions. Right now, I'd like to hand over to John Cartwright, who's with the Global Risk Governance Program, since we have about 40 minutes left. So John is going to be using my computer, so I'm just going to shift it around to him. So John's, what he wants to do is kind of raise some particular points and then to have some kind of questions and answers thereafter. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Guy. And thank you, Siphelele, for a very interesting contextualization of the matter of safer spaces and for the very interesting quick discussion that followed. I'm going to start by presenting very informally a slightly different kind of contextualizing, which I think will complement what Siphelele has presented to us. And some of you, I'm sure many of you who are listening in on this occasion, were also present, cyber-wise, on Wednesday at a previous discussion. And I just want to remind us that on that occasion, Julie Berg, an ex-colleague, who was previously at Centre of Criminology at UCT and is now in Scotland, very forcefully and directly raised the point that we in South Africa particularly tend, when we think of safety and security, only too many people in the state, in NGOs, and generally us as people, we immediately think police, or we think the state. And I do not want to question the role of the state in this matter at all. Quite clearly, we need, like any community, a professional, reliable, answerable, and fair-minded police service. In order to do their particular contribution, which is through enforcing the law. But, as Julia reminded us, there's a huge amount outside that, and this is where we are on this occasion. So let's then, and this was started off, in fact, or became explicit from 1994, when out of those extremely interesting discussions about what kind of policing, what kind of peacemaking do we need, excuse me, in the new South Africa, one of the things that came out was the CPFs, Community Policing Forums, as one way of trying to heal and bridge the enormous gap that had been there for centuries, essentially, in South Africa, between the police and the policed, particularly those policed who were not classified as white, and for whom policing was less a constructive service than a form of oppression. So community then becomes not exactly center stage, but becomes very much into the conversation and into the language. So what do we mean by the community or community? I presume in this context, we mean anyone who is not actually a professional, full-time person doing safety and security, such as SAPs, such as all the various municipal and metro law enforcement agencies, and even also including private security, those private security companies that can be regarded as properly professional and are registered and do what they're supposed to do. So when we have such a broad definition, it means anybody, professional or not, has some kind of possible contribution to make. And let's start with the simplest possible, a granny or an auntie sitting on a stoop in a busy area, seeing people come and go daily and noting different patterns happening in front of her, which could be of particular interest. This is local knowledge. Local knowledge is referring to the expertise of people who happen to live in, work in, or be committed to a particular community in another sense, neighborhood or area. So the question then, and I think this is something that Siphelele has touched on, how does one actually mobilize and make effective all the kind of knowledge that we know resides in people's minds, wherever they may live, about the place in which they live, because they are the experts. How do we draw on that expertise? Take it going back to the auntie on her stoop. Particular times in a pattern, which could be of very useful intelligence to the state agencies concerned, whether local or national. How does she actually do that? What kind of institutional arrangements? This is, I think, what Siphelele was talking about in the question at the end. What kind of institutional arrangements are there that may turn local knowledge into highly usable, practical and effective consequences? Now, there are many ways. Neighborhood watches, before I get on to specifics, another way which I would like to suggest in which we can understand these possibilities is through the concept of placemaking. Now, this comes, I think, from professional environmental design, very specific physical places. But I think one can, and we do, take it further into placemaking for safety. Now, how does this work? I and others have been doing work. We do a workshop, for example, with a group of people, say from a neighborhood watch. What we start off by doing, and I just want to spend too much time on the details, but it gives you something we ask them to make a map, draw an informal map of your neighborhood. And with all the roads, the important roads, churches, police stations, pedestrian crossings, railway lines, whatever you think is relevant. And then, when you're satisfied with that, make a green mark wherever you feel safe. And then make a red mark wherever you feel unsafe. And we get them to say, what is it about that place that makes you feel safe? What are the combination of circumstances? Is it the way it is actually designed? Is it because people are of a well-established establishment with good security, whatever? And for the occasions when you feel unsafe, what can be done about it? So back to the auntie on the stoop. She needs to be connected. And this is something that's already been mentioned. How can she best be connected? Now, neighborhood watches, I think, have the tremendous capacity to provide that, which is not fully exploited. Neighborhood watches tend, on the whole, to be enthusiastic about patrolling, being supportive of the police, connecting with the police, which is fine. But to me, that really is a very inadequate way of mobilizing local knowledge through a neighborhood initiative. Rather, one should be to get into the state of saying, when I walk around the street, what is it I see and what is it I feel? And how, if I see lights missing, who do I report it to? And how do I hold them accountable? And it seems to me that neighborhood watches, if they saw themselves as placemaking organizations as well as patrolling organizations, they would have a huge amount to contribute, which would add enormously to the available intelligence of the local law enforcement agencies. They would be able much more clearly to identify, hotspots, things that problematic buildings and all the rest of it. So that's one on the ground way of doing placemaking for public safety. I want to briefly refer to the idea of improvement districts as another interesting way of doing it. And let me say, I don't think it's an either or at all. I think all of these various kinds of initiatives can and should be encouraged. It's not one doing better than another. They each take a slightly different approach. Now, what's very interesting about the improvement districts, of which there are, I think, nearly 30 in Cape Town now, is that they are an interesting hybrid between community knowledge and professional knowledge and professional accountability. In Cape Town in particular, the accounting organization to which they are responsible in various ways is the City Council. The City Council, a certain amount of rates are added, which goes to the improvement district that has been set up. And the process of setting it up is also very clearly organized. It's very open and accountable in itself. But once one has been set up, the budget is there, and that can be used and must be used in order to add to the security of that neighborhood, to also, there is a social aspect to it, of dealing with the homeless, for example. So it's adding on, not conflicting with, but adding on to the capacity of the state at the local level. And in my experience, being very much involved with a couple of improvement districts over the years, I have to say that they could be abused in order just to provide services to a privileged few. But that's not actually the way they work at all. That the contributions to public safety that they are able to make by establishing close relationships with the city's services, whether it's law enforcement or roads or health or whatever, and with other NGOs and with locals, that contribution can be a very powerful one. And it's one way, it's one vessel, if you might say, one channel through which local knowledge can take on an active form of which can then be implemented by the people themselves. If it's just getting in touch with City Council yourself and saying, hey, the lights are out, what are you going to do about it? And you get a reference number in Cape Town, you can follow it up. So that's kind of citizen activism in itself. But something like an improvement district or a neighborhood watch has a bit more pull as a community-based organization and is recognized as such in either by legislation or by local regulation. So that immediately gives them a kind of access of bridging this gap that CPFs were also intended to bridge. And what makes them, I think, in this context, more likely to be effective than many CPFs is that, for example, the improvement districts have a budget, and neighborhood watches are actually literally feet on the street all the time. That's part of their being. Whereas CPFs have a somewhat more abstract but still important liaison and oversight role. Another way of looking at things, so I'm just sketching how from the bottom up, and then finding links and partnerships, which is very important, this is what it's all about, partnerships growing from the recognized need to have them. So the auntie on the stoop, if she's alerted to it, will think, how do I get this information to somebody? And the somebody is probably a representative of the state, right? However, one can go even broader. In placemaking for public safety, contributions are made all the time, all over the country, in every community, by people who don't know that they're actually doing it. For example, feeding schemes, right? Feeding schemes surely contribute to public safety, yeah? All kinds of educational establishments contribute to public safety. So one can actually draw that scope very widely. But I have tended to concentrate, and I think that's right, on ways in which that local knowledge can be actually channeled appropriately, either to the community themselves to do stuff or to various organs of the state. Before I stop and open up for more discussion, I just want to put to you a series of principles that we have found very useful. They came out of discussions that the Centre of Criminology was asked to have with the Western Cape Department of Community Safety several years ago, in order to help define what is it that a provincial Department of Community Safety does, and on what basis should they recognize interventions that would be useful. I'm just going to get it right off my computer right now to make sure I don't miss out. So the first one is, this is not so much for the state organizations and enforcement, but this is from the community direction of what to do and how to do it. First is focus on the future. not the past. Police are almost inevitably focusing on the future. There is a crime prevention aspect to it, but the best crime prevention that the police can do is to be really good at law enforcement. That's the best that the police can do. Crime prevention is not really directly and explicitly a police function. It's for the rest of us to get on with it. So focus on the future and not the past, to make the future better instead of trying to fix the past, right? So the question is to ask them in these community projects is not who is to blame, but how did this come to happen? What were the circumstances and the root causes that brought this about? This particular stabbing on the street corner, for example. And what is it we can do about it to change those circumstances? So how can we try and see to it that it is less likely to happen again? Number two, focus on opportunities. How can we make a harm less likely to happen again? And I say harm rather than crime, because crime is a very distinct definition. And there are many aspects of things that happen in communities that disturb the peace and safety that are not defined as crime, but are really harmful. So what opportunities are there to encourage positive attitudes and to engage in constructive action, such as saying, what happened on that street corner was we're not patrolling it ourselves. It's a rundown building with people going in and out. It's suspicious, problem building, going to the municipality. The lights are off, whatever. So it's all about problem solving, using local knowledge. The third, think issue-based partnership. That is the so-called whole of society approach. So it's all very well to have committees sitting which have a lot of different representatives from organizations on them, such as the community safety forums. But unless there is a specific issue that they are focusing on and trying to find a solution for, it tends to be just talk, talk, talk. So how do we go about it? You identify, mobilize, and integrate whatever range of knowledge, capacity, and resources are necessary for dealing effectively for that particular problem. So a whole of society approach isn't just getting people from different organizations around safety to sit together in a room. That's a start. But where it starts happening is if they say, okay, that is the problem. Who of the people sitting around in this room can do what? And how are we going to do it? And what is the action plan? And finally, different problems and opportunities require different solutions, which follows on from what I've just said. So there isn't just a one-fits-all, call the police to deal with it, or call Metro Police, deal with it. It's rather what's going on there, who is needed, and how do we get in touch with them? And do we have a kind of institutional arrangement, informal or not, which enables us quickly to get in touch with the people who are needed? I think I'll stop there and we can have some further discussion if you like.
Thanks so much, John, sort of swinging it around to my side. And I'd like to open up for any comments or questions following on from John's presentation. Please do raise your hand. Right, whilst people are thinking about important questions to raise, John wants to make one more point, so I'm going to hand back to John.
Yeah, just something that came up from Siphelele right at the end is how do you scale up these things? Very, very important indeed, because there are so many good things happening around the country of NGOs and community-based organizations and individuals doing good things, but we often don't have the space to reflect on them. What is it about them that it works and how can it be built on? So I think the examples I've given, and I can also give an example that we were very much involved in before about peace committees. That was how do we build an institution that works? How do we build management structures, priorities, and processes that enable it to keep going and be recognized? Otherwise, so many things just fade away when people burn out.
Thanks, John. That's a really important question. I don't see any hands yet, so I maybe want to pose a question whilst other people are thinking about questions or comments to Siphelele and John around both of you have presented on innovations, and if we're going to solve difficult problems and improve safety, and these are not easy solutions. And one's particularly working with the state, which is not often creative, it's bureaucratic, and it's stuck in kind of technical aspects. And I know there are a number of people in this room. How is anyone, either of the speakers or anyone else, kind of got some ideas of how do you work with governments which are kind of very much stuck in kind of budget straitjackets, in kind of performance appraisals? It makes it very difficult for the state at different levels to be creative because of all these bureaucratic constraints in place. Do you have any ideas on how to try and, kind of bring about creative solutions? John, do you want to come in here? Yeah.
Sure, very good question indeed, and sometimes a very heartbreaking kind of matter. I think in this context, I would say that the most important function of the state is to have a regulatory function, to make sure that in principle, organizations, institutions on the ground are operating within the law, but should not control them. I think neighborhood watches are a pretty good example of this, that there is nothing stopping people going patrolling, but they can't beat people up. They can't just stop them in the street and say, let me search you. So there are limits, but as long as people don't get across the legislation, across normal everyday lawfulness, there's a great deal that can be done. I was some years ago involved with a program, a project committee from the South African Law Reform Commission about alternative dispute resolution in the country. After a huge amount of consultation, it came back to the committee to make proposals. And it took a long time, but there were judges, there were people specializing in children's agencies and law, et cetera, And what came out of it in the end was some very, very simple principles. It wasn't requiring new state agency. It wasn't requiring new regulation. What we eventually came up with, and all the state representatives there actually said in the end, yeah, that's right, that the minister concerned should have the right to offer assistance to and recognize an alternative dispute resolution agency, provided that A, the organization explicitly forbids the use of force, B, is able to give to record and have answerable all its meetings, and finally, that it is also financially accountable. Beyond that, it's up to the communities to get going and create institutions that fulfill those criteria. So for me, the state clearly obviously has its own responsibilities in law enforcement, but when it comes to the so-called community, their focus is on facilitation. The state is not good at doing community-based work, right? Can awfully get in the way, and I think can do an extremely useful function if it regulates, facilitates, and encourages on the basis of obviously reliable, sustainable local organizational work.
Thanks so much, John. That's a really well-considered response. Siphelele, do you have any responses to maybe to John's presentation or to any other issues?
Really nothing much different to what John has said. I think he's hit the nail right on the head. I think he articulates much better and very well the point I made around the kind of state intervention, whether a particular form of state intervention is needed in a setting or a context, or what needs to be happening is happening through community effort, and really just needs enabling, regulating, and facilitating. And I think it speaks back to the point you were making around how do you partner and innovate with the state, which is kind of bound by regulations, the technical budgets, and kind of in a straitjacket in terms of its ability to to jump into a space, to respond very quickly, and be innovative. So I think what John has said is kind of a great articulation of exactly what I mean about the right forms of state intervention in a setting where you are partnering with them, very cognizant of the limitations that they face. So nothing much more to say than that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Siphelele. Melanie, your hand is up. Over to you.
Yes. I see Tulani and Thomas are in the room. But you know, I'm actually feeling a bit demoralized at the moment, to be honest with you. And I think in terms of how we actually create the enabling environment, and I'm thinking of particularly some of the municipalities we're working with in the Eastern Cape and in other areas where the challenges they face, one, are institutional capacity, and secondly, really dealing with really impoverished communities. So there may be some initiatives that are taking place in the community, but in many of those communities, I think there's an expectation that the state will support it in some way through some kind of funding and resources, and that's not always possible. So I kind of want to separate my question, and I guess it's more of a reflection for someone like John and others who've been doing this for a long time, is looking at really the role of the state as an enabler, and what have we learned at a policy level in terms of really creating the appropriate environment. So I think we spoke about assigning budgets, and I think, was it the day before yesterday, someone raised the importance of the IDP in terms of securing some kind of a commitment from local governments, particularly small local governments like LMs and even in some case district municipalities, where there's very, very limited capacity to actually provide that support, and to actually even make the argument for a budget allocation. And in some of the municipalities I'm working with at the moment, at a very, very practical level, GIZ has made available the technical support to these municipalities, but they really don't have actually capacity. They don't have people power to even work with. So and under the current COVID environment, and I think as we shift to local government elections, that's even going to get more intense. And so my question really is, what really realistic can we do in terms of, as a state, being an enabler in a very practical way? And I think I really liked the comment was made about something like simple, like alcohol harms reduction, in maybe taking something we don't typically think of as a lever into a community. And I guess I just want people to share their reflections, and having worked in the sector for so long, do we really need to think more creatively, particularly in Siphelele? I know in cities they're very well resourced, and in the Western Cape we're very, very lucky because there has been political buy-in, both at the level of the province. But in other areas we're not seeing that. And how do we deal with that challenge as practitioners?
Great. I've got Melanie. Thank you so much for your comments and for your questions. I've got Tulani. Your hand is up, so I'm going to give Tulani an opportunity to ask his question, and then we can hand back to the speakers if they want to respond. So Tulani, over to you.
Thanks, Guy. My question is related to Melanie's inputs. A direct question to John to say, we are all agreeing that government or state entities are responsible for the regulatory framework. In the context of municipalities, we all know that they're expected to drive local safety or prevention interventions, and they're faced with numerous challenges from capacity, political will, and from fiscal constraints or restraints. Picking up on your discussions and input, do you see the role of other partners? With regard to security, we know that private securities or private companies are already involved. But with regard to prevention, and in particular, like drawing that safety plan or safety audit, what is the role of other stakeholders in facilitating and supporting and or complementing the work of government at local level? And do we have evidence or examples that we can scale up?
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
To give John an opportunity to respond, and then Siphelele, if you'd like to come in. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Tulani. Yeah, very good question. I can answer by giving you one example. The late Dullah Omar was our first Minister of Justice after the 1994 elections. My colleague Clifford Shearing had been working very closely with him and others. And later in the 1990s, Dullah asked Clifford, okay, you talk a lot about local knowledge. Well, just show me. And that was the challenge. And out of that came, starting in the community of Zwelathemba by Worcester, what came to be called peace committees. And Dullah Omar was very explicit in his recognition that this was not a state organization at all, but that as long as it operated within the law, it could and should make a difference to local people, which it did, because it drew explicitly on what they knew of troubles in the community. So it's possible. The end of the story is a little sad, however. After something like 9 years of activity and something like 48,000 peace committees fully transcribed and recorded, the National Cabinet was funding it, but then Mr. Zuma came in, which was not a great thing, and it was also, there were certain people in the police at higher level who didn't like it, so it came to an end. But on the local level, which is what we were talking about, Tulani, the police in local police stations and local communities and magistrates thought, oh, this is just what we need, because it deals with the small things in the communities, which if they're not dealt with, turn into big things, shack burnings and all the rest. So it was really grassroots stuff, but constantly in friendly contact with municipality and SAPs. So I'm saying that perhaps even in the Eastern Cape, where there might be dysfunction on the municipal level, it's possible for people to get together and start peacefully to doing work of this kind. But the problem is that our attitude has been so dominated by the assumptions about the state's got to do it, that it's hard to get that off the ground. So I do accept it's a problem, but having sat in hundreds of peace committee gatherings over a number of years and just observed these marvelous people, many of whom were illiterate and most of whom were unemployed, doing the most extraordinary, insightful and sympathetic and peaceful work. I have no doubt at all about local capacity.
Thank you so much, John. Siphelele, do you have any comments or responses?
I think I also just want to pick up on what John said about sometimes you have interventions that are very well constituted and structured partnerships between the local state and various other actors embedded in communities. But I think sometimes we understate the role and potential of politics, the interface of it within that space. And so a lot of the time, even if interventions are good and effective, they fall victim to political changes. And the change in administrations in cities, sometimes you'll find that a city was well established in a particular area of work, but over 14 years, also given like staff turnover, there isn't much of an institutional memory existing to sustain that. Then it would have to start from scratch. On the flip side, again, I think going back to the point around institutions that are not able to innovate and be as flexible as they could be, because they are bound by regulations, budgets, and the straitjacket effect. I think there's another aspect to it, and I was just popped into my mind after I gave my previous response, that in as much as those things can have a negative impact on innovation and partnerships, at the same time they are the things that enable the desirable kind of interventions to happen. So if things don't exist in plans, they can't be budgeted for, and if they aren't budgeted for, they can't be implemented. So just it's quite a complex space. While a lot is possible, while there's a lot of opportunity, there are constraints, of course, but even within those constraints, there are benefits, meaning that the kinds of support that is needed by local actors from the state can't happen if things don't exist in like formalized, sometimes very restrictive, but also enabling plans. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Siphelele. We have a few minutes left, so is there anyone who'd like to ask one more question? Right, I don't see any hands at the moment. It is Friday afternoon, so people, I'm sure, are a bit tired. John has indicated that he's happy to share with anyone who's interested a copy of the Neighborhood Safety Handbook. So if anyone would like to, you're welcome to make contact with myself or with John. John, are you willing to share your email address?
My email address is johnc, JOHNC, @vanilla, vanilla.coza. johnc@vanilla.coza. Just the last comment I wanted to make, arising out of the discussion we have about that Siphelele is also talking about the difficulty of getting things going through the state. The peace committees came to an end because people, so-called high up, both in government and in the police, did not truly believe in the capacity of local people. They did not respect that, and they felt threatened by it. Contrary to the experience of all the people we came across in the ground, of police, law enforcement, town councillors, etc., who were able to see it at close hand and were able to monitor it. So we have, in other words, a very big attitude problem still of assumptions.
Thank you so much, John. I'm just trying to see if someone's made a comment in the comment section. Right, let's just see. Okay, so just to make a point that Francesca's made is that we are having these webinars every single week. So the next one, the title is going to be looking at parenting programs and the impact parenting programs have been having within South Africa. We have a number of interventions. So we will be putting out the invitation early next week. And of course, we'll also be putting up a list of other topics that we'll be hosting as webinars on SaferSpaces. So thank you so much for making the time to be here. I'm not sure if anyone from the Civilian Secretariat or GIZ would like to say a concluding comment before we end this session.
Nothing to add from my side, Guy. Just a big thank you to the two speakers for the inputs and for making it regardless of load shedding, and also the participants for your active contributions. Many thanks and have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thanks, Francie. I don't know whether Matlakala would like to say something as well. If, yeah. Oh, I see she has typed something on the chat.
Not much to learn. Thank you, Guy and team, for everything. I think we learn it every day. So I provide recognize the comment, especially from the government supporting some other initiatives. So yeah, something to do. Thank you for your colleague.
Thanks, Dr. Hannah. Melanie, do you have a quick comment before we end? Quick question? Melanie, we continue. Melanie's hand is gone. All right, so we're going to bring it to an end. Just to say thank you so much to Siphelele, Ngobese, and John Cartwright for making the time and giving a really interesting presentation for this particular session. I was a bit worried that with two presentations we would not take up the time, but clearly we did. So thank you to both of you. Really appreciate it. And this session is being recorded and will be posted on SaferSpaces. So thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys.